From the very first moment, the stark reality of injustice shattered the pretense of equality. The brazen display of discrimination, raw, unfiltered, and deeply offensive, exposed an institution that claims to uphold fairness while perpetuating cruelty. Every dismissive glance, every unprovoked act of contempt, is a scar on the conscience of society. How long will we tolerate the abuse of power, the humiliating treatment of those who deserve nothing less than respect? This isn't merely a story, it's a wake-up call to every individual who believes in justice. It's time to rise in anger, demand accountability, and dismantle the systemic prejudice that poisons our shared spaces. Serena Carter's day began like any other in her long, disciplined career. For over 2 decades, she'd woken before dawn, ready to serve and protect, a beacon of integrity in a system that sometimes faltered. Today, however, was different. Having just completed her shift as Chief of Operations in Metro City's Public Safety Department, Serena decided to travel as herself, no uniform, no badge, just a weary human being seeking solace and perspective at an industry conference in Lakeside. The alarm on her phone had roused her at 4:30 a.m., and though she felt the weight of exhaustion, she also carried a quiet resolve. It wasn't that she doubted the value of her career, rather, she longed for a moment where she could just be Serena, not the emblem of authority. Carefully choosing an outfit that whispered professionalism without the regalia of her past life, Serena tucked her police chief's badge into a discreet inner pocket of her carry-on. She believed that, for one day, she could blend into the crowd of ordinary passengers. Arriving at Lakeside International Airport, the cool morning air greeted her as she stepped out of her taxi. The terminal bustled with travelers, each absorbed in their own journeys. With a practiced calm, Serena navigated through the crowds, her thoughts lingering on the conference ahead, a chance to learn, to share experiences, and perhaps to find new ways to heal the fractures in a system she had once dedicated her life to. But as she approached the check-in counter for Azure Skies Airways, a subtle yet disquieting sensation began to creep in. The uniformed airline staff glanced at her with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed suspicion. It was then that she heard it, a whispered word that sliced through the ambient hum of busy travelers: fraudulent. A voice, crisp and unyielding, echoed from behind the counter. "Step aside, ma'am," commanded a stern-faced attendant named Fiona Lewis, her tone laced with an undercurrent of derision. The word fraudulent seemed to hang in the air like a dark omen, attaching itself to Serena in an instant. Suddenly, the warm familiarity of the terminal turned cold and unwelcoming. Serena's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, her mind racing to understand. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" she asked calmly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Her eyes met Fiona's, who, without missing a beat, began typing on her computer as if following a script rehearsed countless times before. As she waited, Serena couldn't help but notice the subtle exchange of glances between Fiona and a nearby colleague, a fellow agent in the airline's hierarchy. Their expressions, barely masked with condescension, painted a clear picture. Serena's presence was an anomaly in a well-ordered routine designed for a different sort of passenger. Time seemed to slow as each minute passed. The fluorescent lights above flickered with a sterile brightness, contrasting sharply with the darkening cloud of unease that now loomed over Serena. The casual hum of conversation fell silent in that small corner of the terminal as curious onlookers began to take notice. Whispers grew louder, and Serena could almost hear the unspoken judgment, a verdict rendered before any proper verification had taken place. She reflected on her past experiences, moments when her authority and calm were met with skepticism simply because of her identity. In her former role, she had seen the quiet indignation on the faces of those who, like her, had been unjustly singled out. But today, the injustice was personal. It wasn't just a bureaucratic error or a minor inconvenience, it was a deliberate act, an accusation fueled by prejudice. Serena's mind recalled every instance where the system she had once upheld had faltered, where the very tools designed to ensure order instead became instruments of exclusion. She had fought against injustice for years, yet here she was, a victim of the very discrimination she had vowed to eradicate. Each second of waiting deepened the sting of betrayal and humiliation. At last, after what felt like an eternity, a supervisor stepped forward. His name tag read, Michael Reyes, and his expression carried the weariness of someone who had witnessed this scenario more times than he cared to admit. He reviewed the ticket on the screen with practiced precision. The words, "First Class," glowed back at him in a reassuring font. Michael's confirmation that the ticket was valid, while intended to restore order, did little to soothe Serena's wounded pride. Instead, it laid bare the irony: despite a system that confirmed her status, the suspicion remained. "Are you sure there isn't a problem?" Fiona insisted, her tone dripping with condescension as if the very idea of a black woman purchasing a first-class ticket was preposterous. Serena's eyes searched the room, catching fleeting glances from other passengers, some filled with sympathy, others with a hesitant, almost fearful acknowledgement of the injustice unfolding before them. Inside, Serena felt a tumult of emotions: anger at the implicit accusation, sadness for the pain inflicted not just upon her, but upon everyone who had ever suffered a similar fate. Yet she maintained a poised exterior. "I purchased this ticket with my own money," she stated simply, her voice resonating with quiet dignity. Despite the confirmation on Michael's screen, Fiona's demeanor did not soften. Instead, she doubled down on her scrutiny. Each keystroke on her keyboard, every skeptical glance exchanged with her colleague, reinforced a narrative that Serena was somehow out of place, a narrative that had no basis in truth. It was as if her very presence was a disruption to the established order, a challenge to the invisible boundaries that had been drawn along lines of skin color and socioeconomic status. In that moment, Serena's mind wandered back to the countless hours she had spent de-escalating conflicts on the streets, trying to bridge the gap between authority and the public. Now, here in this modern-day coliseum of prejudice, she was on the opposite end, facing not an unruly mob, but a small group of airline staff armed with protocols and personal biases. The irony was palpable: a guardian of justice reduced to standing silently, her valid ticket and loyal reputation unable to shield her from a barrage of unwarranted suspicion. As the minutes stretched on, the environment grew even more tense. Passengers who had once been absorbed in their own routines now watched with bated breath, some recording the scene on their smartphones. The air was thick with anticipation, the muted murmurs of onlookers merging with Serena's internal monologue, a litany of memories, disappointments, and a steadfast refusal to be diminished by this moment of indignity. Serena's thoughts were punctuated by a profound sense of isolation. She was acutely aware that, in that instant, every eye in the terminal was fixed upon her, not as a celebrated public servant, but as a subject of baseless scrutiny. The weight of centuries of prejudice bore down on her, and yet she refused to succumb. Every fiber of her being, every ounce of her professional training, urged her to remain composed, to let the truth speak for itself even when the echoes of injustice reverberated through the silent hall. In a final act of dignified defiance, Serena quietly retrieved her boarding pass from her bag. The document, a testament to her hard work and perseverance, was now a symbol of both her right to travel and the painful reality of discrimination. With a steady hand and unwavering resolve, she placed the pass on the counter once more. "This is my boarding pass," she reiterated, her tone firm and measured, challenging the room to either refute the undeniable truth or continue down the path of unyielding bias. As she waited for the final confirmation that would allow her to board the flight, Serena's mind raced with thoughts of the upcoming conference. She wondered if the day would eventually turn around, if she might find solace and solidarity among colleagues who respected her for who she was, not for the color of her skin. Yet, even as hope flickered in the recesses of her heart, the chill of this morning's encounter lingered, a stark reminder that the battle against prejudice was far from over. The terminal, once a place of transit and casual exchanges, had transformed into a stage for an all-too-familiar drama. The scripted nature of the encounter, the calculated gestures of superiority by Fiona and her colleagues, and the silent complicity of the onlookers all painted a vivid picture of a system deeply flawed. A system where the measure of a person's worth was distorted by prejudices that clung to the past like stubborn shadows. Serena's internal strength, honed by years of confronting injustice on the front lines, began to radiate outward. Though she was physically just one among many travelers, in that moment, she stood as a symbol, a silent protest against an archaic mindset that sought to strip her of dignity. In her mind, she reaffirmed a simple truth: her identity, her accomplishments, and her worth were beyond reproach. They could not be diminished by a few cold words or a fleeting moment of intolerance. As the final minutes ticked away, a sense of anticipation mixed with defiance filled the air. Serena's eyes, though tired, shone with the fire of resilience. She knew that her journey, both literal and metaphorical, had taken an unexpected turn, one that would challenge her in ways she had never imagined. But with every trial came the opportunity to stand tall and, perhaps, to spark change in a system that desperately needed it. At last, the attendant's voice cut through the silence once more. "Your ticket is valid," Fiona announced in a tone that, while outwardly placid, carried an unmistakable note of reluctant concession. The confirmation should have been a relief, yet it did little to erase the sting of the earlier ordeal. It was a hollow victory, a technicality that did nothing to address the deep-seated issues laid bare that morning. Serena gathered her belongings, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She stepped away from the counter with measured grace, leaving behind a scene that was as charged with unspoken conflict as it was with the hum of daily airport life. As she walked toward the departure gate, her pace steady and deliberate, she couldn't help but wonder, how many others had silently borne the weight of such injustice? And what would it take for the tide to finally turn in favor of true equality? What would you do if you found yourself in Serena's shoes? After the tense encounter at the check-in counter, Serena Carter moved forward with a heavy heart and cautious determination. The ordeal at Azure Skies Airways had not faded, instead, it had woven itself into her thoughts like an unwelcome refrain. With the ticket finally validated, she now faced another hurdle, the security checkpoint, a stage where protocol and prejudice too often intersected. Stepping up to the scanner, Serena's mind was still reeling from the earlier episode. The bright lights overhead and the rhythmic hum of the conveyor belt seemed to emphasize the clinical detachment of the process. Yet, as she placed her carry-on bag on the scanner and began to remove her shoes, a series of subtle, yet pointed, actions set her nerves on edge. A security officer, whose name tag read Hector Alvarez, eyed her with an intensity that bordered on scrutiny. It was as if, in his mind, the mere sight of Serena triggered a litany of unwarranted suspicions. His eyes flickered over her meticulously arranged belongings and lingered on the subtle elegance of her appearance, a stark contrast to the hurried, utilitarian luggage of other passengers. "Ma'am, please step aside for a secondary screening," Hector instructed, his voice devoid of warmth. The command was delivered with an air of finality that left no room for protest. The simple act of asking her to step aside, though couched in routine security protocol, carried with it an unmistakable implication: Serena was being singled out. A murmur of discontent passed among nearby travelers. Some glanced at Serena with a mixture of empathy and discomfort, while others averted their eyes, unwilling to be embroiled in a situation that seemed to challenge their own unspoken biases. For Serena, every moment that passed in that designated area felt like a trial by fire, a test of her resolve in the face of an injustice she had long battled in other forms. Reluctantly, Serena complied. With each measured step toward the isolated screening area, her inner turmoil surged. Her thoughts raced back to countless instances where she had witnessed or experienced similar treatment, moments when her worth was questioned simply because of who she was. The memories were bitter, yet they steeled her determination not to let this latest encounter defeat her. Inside the secondary screening room, the atmosphere was starkly different from the bustling terminal outside. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the bare walls, amplifying the sense of isolation. Here, Serena was alone with her doubts and the persistent hum of the security machinery, a constant reminder that in this space, her identity was being meticulously dissected. Hector returned, his face inscrutable, as he methodically inspected her belongings. His hands, clad in blue gloves, handled each item with a deliberate slowness that bordered on excessive. Every beep of the scanner echoed like a verdict being pronounced. When he reached for her carry-on bag, Serena's pulse quickened. The bag, a repository of her carefully arranged personal and professional necessities, was now under the microscope of an officer whose every movement seemed laden with prejudice. "What exactly is in this bag?" Hector demanded, his tone carrying an accusatory edge. He reached in, probing the contents with a mechanical detachment that belied the undercurrent of suspicion in his gaze. Serena watched as he pulled out neatly folded clothes, a small toiletry kit, and, inevitably, the cherished memento she carried for her daughter, a delicate snow globe that symbolized hope and family. The object, innocuous to any other, had now become a focal point for his scrutiny. "This seems out of place," he remarked, almost as if the presence of such a sentimental item was an anomaly that needed justification. Serena's heart sank, but she steadied herself with a deep breath. "It's a keepsake," she replied softly, "something to remind me of home." Her voice was gentle yet firm, a quiet assertion of her right to carry her personal history without being subjected to baseless interrogation. Despite her calm explanation, Hector's demeanor remained unchanged. The officer's eyes narrowed as he resumed his inspection, tapping on the keyboard of his device with an urgency that suggested he was determined to find a discrepancy where none existed. The sterile sounds of the machine and the rustling of papers punctuated the silence that had descended upon the room. In that moment, Serena's mind was awash with a blend of anger and sorrow. How many times had she, and others like her, been reduced to mere subjects of an invasive process, where every gesture, every belonging, was weighed against an invisible metric of otherness. The security checkpoint, a space meant to ensure safety, had morphed into a crucible of discrimination, a place where the scales of justice were tainted by the biases of those entrusted with enforcing them. Outside, the waiting area grew increasingly restless. Other passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their curiosity mingling with a sense of powerlessness. Some began to record the incident discreetly on their smartphones, a silent act of solidarity that spoke volumes about their own unspoken condemnations of the discriminatory practice unfolding before them. The unintentional audience bore witness to the injustice, their silent recordings a modern-day archive of a moment that was both deeply personal and alarmingly systemic. As minutes turned into what felt like an eternity, Hector finally reassembled the contents of Serena's bag and reinserted them into a neat pile. His final glance, filled with an unspoken accusation, lingered on the snow globe before he reluctantly allowed her to proceed. "You're cleared," he said curtly, his tone betraying neither regret nor satisfaction. Stepping back into the main terminal, Serena was greeted by a renewed flurry of activity. However, the brief glimpse of normalcy outside the secondary screening room could not erase the lingering sting of the experience. Each step she took was now heavy with the weight of the accumulated indignities, a constant reminder that the path to equality was marred by obstacles built from outdated prejudices. In the ensuing moments, as she rejoined the flow of passengers moving toward the departure gate, Serena's thoughts turned inward. The encounter at security was more than just an isolated incident, it was a microcosm of a broader societal malaise, a pervasive, insidious bias that seeped into every corner of public life. The structured efficiency of modern travel had become a veneer, beneath which lay the stark realities of discrimination. Serena's inner monologue was a torrent of reflections on identity, justice, and the cost of progress. She recalled the countless times she had used her position to advocate for fairness, to shield those who could not defend themselves against the systemic forces of prejudice. Yet now, in a moment where she was both the defender and the defender of her own dignity, she felt the harsh sting of irony. The very system she had labored to uphold was now subjecting her to a trial by suspicion, a trial in which the only evidence against her was her presence, her identity, and the unyielding eyes of those who believed in an outdated hierarchy. As Serena resumed her journey through the terminal, her gaze swept over the familiar faces of fellow travelers. Some offered brief, apologetic nods, others kept their eyes fixed on distant points, as if to avoid the uncomfortable recognition that injustice could be so close. In the quiet interstices between announcements and the rolling of luggage wheels, a silent question emerged: how many more would have to endure such indignities before real change took hold? The security check had been a stark reminder of the layered challenges that defined her reality, a reality where every step toward progress was met with resistance from an entrenched system that valued conformity over compassion. Yet even in the face of such adversity, Serena's resolve hardened. She knew that her journey was far from over, that each encounter with discrimination was a call to action, a call to document, to speak out, and ultimately, to change the narrative. Clutching her boarding pass and the remnants of her shaken composure, Serena pressed forward toward the gate, her mind already forming strategies for the conference ahead. This was not merely about reaching a destination, it was about confronting the pervasive inequities that lurked in every corner of society, even in places as seemingly mundane as an airport security line. As she walked, Serena's thoughts turned to the power of collective action. The recordings on smartphones, the sympathetic glances, and even the silent solidarity of strangers provided a counterpoint to the prejudice she had faced. They were a testament to the fact that while discrimination might still cast its long shadow, there was an emerging light of accountability, a light that could be kindled by each act of quiet resistance. In that moment, the airport was transformed from a passageway of travel into a crucible for change. The harsh reality of the security check was not lost on the broader community, it was a spark that could ignite a wider conversation about fairness and dignity. Serena's experience was emblematic of a struggle that resonated with many, a struggle to reclaim spaces that had long been dominated by fear and suspicion. By the time she reached the departure gate, the initial sting of the security ordeal had begun to give way to a determined resolve. Serena knew that her path was fraught with challenges, that each step forward in the journey toward equality required not only personal fortitude but also a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And as she prepared to board the flight, the echoes of the security check remained with her, a reminder that true progress was measured not by the absence of prejudice, but by the courage to challenge it at every turn. How do you think one should respond when faced with such unfair scrutiny in everyday life? After the prolonged ordeal at security, Serena Carter finally reached the boarding gate. However, the journey was far from over. As she stepped into the boarding area, the oppressive air of discrimination still clung to her, leaving behind a bitter taste that she could not easily wash away. The terminal had transformed from a space of travel into a stage for a drama of inequality, a drama that Serena, unwittingly, was destined to endure further. The boarding gate was abuzz with anticipation. Passengers chattered excitedly about their upcoming flights, their voices buoyed by the promise of travel and adventure. Yet, as Serena approached the counter to present her boarding pass once more, the murmur of casual conversation halted abruptly. The attendant, now a different face from the earlier encounter, was visibly perturbed. Her eyes narrowed as they met Serena's, and an unmistakable smirk played at the corners of her mouth. "Good afternoon," the attendant said, her tone clipped and dismissive. "May I see your boarding pass?" There was nothing inherently wrong with the request, yet the way she asked carried an undertone of skepticism. Serena, who had already endured 2 rounds of scrutiny, offered the pass with calm assurance. But as she did, she caught a subtle glance exchanged between the attendant and another crew member stationed near the door, one whose expression suggested that Serena's presence was an anomaly in an otherwise carefully curated environment. The scene that unfolded next was nothing short of disheartening. As the boarding process continued, Serena noticed that other passengers, mostly white, casually confident travelers, were processed with a courteous efficiency that starkly contrasted her own treatment. While the majority of those around her were greeted with smiles and swift clearance, she was repeatedly delayed. Her valid documents were questioned, her seat assignment rechecked, and her status repeatedly verified, each interaction dripping with a condescending tone. Soon, the atmosphere grew tense. Passengers began to take note, some whispered in hushed tones, while others avoided making eye contact, perhaps unwilling to witness what they understood to be an unfolding injustice. The subtle hum of the boarding area was now punctuated by the clicking of keyboards and the rustling of paper, all in an effort to justify a process that had already, in every conceivable way, been flawed. As Serena stepped forward to join the first-class cabin, the door to the aircraft opened, revealing the lavish interior of Azure Sky's Airways Premium section. The luxurious cabin was a far cry from the cold, bureaucratic ambience of the terminal. Plush seats, tasteful decor, and soft lighting created an environment designed to convey exclusivity and comfort. Yet for Serena, these symbols of privilege only deepened the sense of alienation. The cabin crew, clad in their pristine uniforms, moved with an air of practiced indifference, their smiles thin and unconvincing. Once on board, Serena made her way down the narrow aisle toward seat 2A, a seat she had rightfully earned with her purchased ticket. As she passed by rows of fellow first-class passengers, she couldn't help but notice the ease with which they were greeted. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit was offered a second complimentary beverage with barely a word of acknowledgement for his presence. Meanwhile, other passengers were attended to with the kind of care that Serena had once taken pride in as a defender of the public. It was as if an invisible boundary had been drawn, a line that separated those who belonged from those who did not. The first hint of in-flight harassment emerged as Serena attempted to stow her carry-on in the overhead compartment. A flight attendant, whose demeanor was already frosty from earlier interactions, brushed past her without so much as a greeting. When Serena called out politely to request assistance with her bag, the attendant's response was a perfunctory, "Excuse me, ma'am, please wait your turn." The words, though calm in tone, were laden with an implication that Serena's request was an imposition rather than a normal act of travel. Serena's mind raced as she recalled the countless moments in her career when impartiality and respect had been the norm, qualities she had always strived to embody, both as a public servant and as a fellow human being. Yet, here, in the very space designed to ensure the comfort and safety of passengers, she was being treated as an outsider, as if her presence in first class were a mistake to be rectified rather than a right to be respected. As the flight took off, the cabin lights dimmed and the soft hum of the engines filled the space, creating an almost surreal backdrop for what was rapidly becoming a public display of prejudice. Throughout the flight, every interaction with the crew served as a reminder of the earlier injustices. Requests for a glass of water, a blanket, or even a polite nod of acknowledgement were met with delays, curt responses, or, at times, outright dismissals. It was a slow, systematic erasure of her dignity, a deliberate act of marginalization that unfolded with the cold efficiency of a well-rehearsed play. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Serena's calm exterior belied the inner turmoil that churned with every passing minute. Her thoughts shifted between the painful memories of similar encounters in the past and the stark reality of the present. The crew's actions were not isolated incidents but rather part of a broader pattern, a pattern that had been allowed to fester within the corridors of power, unchecked and unchallenged. At one point, as Serena sat quietly in her seat, she observed a scene that sent a fresh wave of shock through her. A passenger seated in 2B, a man whose demeanor exuded quiet authority, attempted to request assistance for a minor discomfort. The attendant, who had earlier been dismissive toward Serena, now treated this man with an immediacy and respect that was glaringly absent in her treatment of Serena. The contrast was stark and undeniable, a silent proclamation that some lives were deemed more valuable, more deserving of courtesy, than others. The unfolding scenario was not lost on the other passengers. Several discreet glances, a few sympathetic frowns, and the furtive tapping of smartphone cameras spoke of a collective recognition of injustice, a recognition that transcended mere inconvenience and touched on the very core of human decency. Even as Serena maintained her composure, a part of her burned with the desire to speak out, to demand that those around her see the blatant disparity in treatment. Yet, she also knew that in the confines of the aircraft, any outburst could escalate the situation beyond repair, jeopardizing not only her own safety but also the already fragile order of the flight. Time on the flight seemed to stretch on interminably. Each moment was a delicate balancing act between endurance and the mounting pressure of unrelenting bias. In the midst of this, Serena's inner resolve solidified. She began to document the sequence of events mentally, every slight and every neglectful gesture noted with the precision of someone who had witnessed too many injustices to allow them to go unnoticed. She was acutely aware that this was not merely about her own suffering, it was a microcosm of a societal failure, a failure that affected countless others who were deemed unworthy of equal treatment. As the hours passed, the in-flight harassment reached a crescendo. A call button that Serena pressed was met with silence, a silence that spoke volumes about the crew's unwillingness to disrupt the status quo. When she repeated her request, the response was not an apology but a perfunctory, "We'll get to it when we can." The dismissive tone was the final nail in the coffin of her patience, a stark confirmation that in the world of Azure Sky's airways, the measure of a person's worth was determined not by their actions or character, but by the color of their skin and the stereotypes that had been ingrained in the system for generations. In that charged atmosphere, every action, every glance, every moment was imbued with meaning, a message that was clear and unequivocal: "You do not belong here." Yet, amidst the pervasive mist of discrimination, Serena's spirit remained unbowed. She clung to the belief that her dignity was not something that could be stripped away by the cold, calculating mechanics of an unjust system. Instead, it was a light that shone from within, a beacon of truth that could not be extinguished, no matter how many times it was challenged. The final act of this harrowing segment of the flight came as the crew made one last pass through the cabin. A flight attendant, now appearing even more agitated than before, addressed the cabin in a tone that was meant to restore order. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "please ensure that all carry-on items are stowed properly and that you remain seated until further notice." The words, intended as a routine reminder, carried an undercurrent of finality, a signal that the flight was returning to normalcy, even as the scars of injustice were freshly etched into the fabric of the journey. Serena sat back in her seat, her eyes reflecting the turbulent mix of exhaustion, defiance, and determination. The gentle hum of the engines, the soft murmur of distant conversations, and the ambient lighting created a temporary refuge from the storm of emotions that raged within her. Yet, as the flight continued toward its destination, the reality remained inescapable: she had been treated as an outsider in a space that was meant for inclusion, and the echoes of that treatment would linger long after the journey had ended. In that quiet, reflective moment, Serena's thoughts turned outward. She wondered how many others had silently borne the weight of such indignities, how many stories of quiet resilience went untold in the sterile corridors of modern travel. The injustice she faced was not unique, it was a part of a larger tapestry of prejudice and exclusion that continued to shape the lives of those who dared to defy the expectations of a biased system. As the aircraft began its descent, a sense of cautious hope began to stir within her. The journey was nearing its end, and with it came the possibility of turning this painful experience into a catalyst for change. Serena knew that her story, her silent protest, might inspire others to demand a more just and equitable world, a world where every traveler was greeted with the respect and dignity they deserved. How would you respond if you experienced such blatant discrimination during your journey? As the flight pressed on, the tension in the first-class cabin had not dissipated, it had only simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a spark. Serena Carter, though visibly affected by the cascade of earlier indignities, had maintained a dignified silence. Yet, it was clear to every observant passenger that the atmosphere was volatile, the crew's thinly veiled disdain and the constant reminders of her otherness were building toward an inevitable confrontation. In the midst of this strained environment, an announcement crackled over the cabin intercom. The voice, crisp and assertive, belonged to Captain Victoria West, a figure whose reputation for discipline and poise was well known among frequent flyers of Azure Sky's airways. The captain's tone, however, carried a coldness that betrayed little warmth or empathy. With deliberate steps, Captain West made her way down the aisle, her polished uniform a stark emblem of the authority she wielded. Passengers instinctively quieted, their conversations replaced by a collective, anxious hush as the captain neared Serena's row. For a moment, the eyes of everyone in the cabin were fixed on the scene unfolding before them, a tableau of conflicting power and vulnerability. Captain West stopped just a few feet away from Serena's seat, her gaze intense and unyielding. There was no preamble, no attempt at courteous conversation. Instead, the silence was shattered by the captain's pointed words, spoken with deliberate disdain. "Is there a problem here, Miss Carter?" Captain West demanded, her voice low yet forceful, leaving no doubt that she intended to reassert control over a situation she perceived as spiraling out of the established order. Serena's heart pounded as she met the captain's gaze. Her mind, still reeling from the earlier encounters, raced to find the right words. "No, Captain. I am simply following the procedures, as is my right," she replied, her tone calm but laced with a quiet, defiant authority that had been honed through years of service and personal sacrifice. The captain's eyes narrowed imperceptibly as if weighing the sincerity in Serena's response. Yet, what followed was unexpected and utterly disarming. With a swift, almost mechanical motion, Captain West's hand shot out and struck Serena across the face, a blow so sudden and jarring that the entire cabin seemed to shudder in its wake. The impact resounded sharply, the sound echoing off the luxurious walls of the aircraft as gasps and murmurs filled the air. For an agonizing moment, time appeared to stand still. The stunned silence was punctuated only by the thudding of Serena's heart and the collective intake of breath from every onlooker. Passengers, who had until now been locked in their private reflections of injustice, now found themselves unwilling witnesses to an act of raw, unmitigated aggression. The slap was not just a physical assault, it was a public repudiation of Serena's dignity, a cruel reminder that in this controlled environment, the power dynamics could shift with brutal finality. Serena's cheek burned with the sting of the blow, but her eyes, steely and resolute, remained fixed on Captain West. The silence in the cabin was almost tangible, heavy with disbelief and a dawning recognition that this was no longer merely a bureaucratic oversight or an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of violence, a symbolic reclaiming of a space that the captain believed Serena had no right to occupy. In the immediate aftermath, chaos threatened to erupt. A few passengers instinctively reached for their smartphones, their fingers trembling as they recorded the unfolding event. Others exchanged hurried, horrified glances. Yet, in the midst of this pandemonium, Serena's reaction was measured. She pressed her hand to her face, not solely out of physical pain but as a quiet, determined assertion that she would not be reduced to a spectacle of abuse. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears of both hurt and indignation, searched the faces of those around her, not for sympathy, but for validation of her right to be treated with respect. Captain West, for her part, seemed momentarily taken aback by the unexpected escalation. Her face, once an implacable mask of authority, now registered a fleeting flicker of uncertainty before hardening once more. "You are being disruptive," she declared, her tone now edged with a mix of anger and indignation. "On my flight, you will adhere to the proper conduct expected of all passengers." But even as she spoke, the reality of her actions was beginning to sink in, not just for Serena, but for everyone present. The captain's slap had shattered the carefully constructed illusion of order that Azure Sky's Airways prided itself on. In that split second, the dynamics had irreversibly shifted. A woman who had endured a series of subtle indignities now stood at the center of an overt act of violence, and the power that had once seemed so unassailable was beginning to crumble. Serena's response was not one of immediate retaliation. Instead, she took a deliberate breath, the pain in her cheek mingling with a fierce resolve. "I have done nothing but assert my rights as a paying passenger," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor of adrenaline. "Your actions speak louder than any accusations could." Her words, though measured, carried the weight of decades spent battling systemic injustice, a reminder that authority untempered by accountability was a fragile veneer, destined to crack under the pressure of truth. The repercussions of that moment rippled through the cabin. A middle-aged businessman in a tailored suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while a young couple in the adjacent row exchanged glances of incredulity. Even the flight attendants, who had earlier treated Serena with dismissive indifference, now looked on with a dawning sense of regret and uncertainty. It was as if the captain's forceful assertion of power had inadvertently exposed the very inequalities and biases that had long been simmering beneath the surface of the airline's operations. Within minutes, murmurs of discontent turned into a low, persistent buzz. Some passengers, emboldened by the sight of Serena's quiet defiance, began to speak in hushed tones about fairness and respect. Others, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama, recorded every detail, each frame a testament to the injustice that had been so publicly perpetrated. In that moment, the cabin was no longer merely a space of travel, it had transformed into a forum for a broader, unspoken reckoning with authority, privilege, and the right to be treated as a human being. As Captain West stood amid the charged silence, a look of hardened determination replaced the initial shock on her face. "This is not a negotiation," she said sternly. "Order will be maintained." Yet, her words, intended to reassert control, now fell flat against the backdrop of a mounting wave of dissent. The passengers' eyes, once passive and compliant, now shone with the beginnings of a collective realization that power, when exercised without accountability, was not invincible. In that crucible of emotion and indignation, Serena slowly gathered herself. With every ounce of her strength, she sought to recenter the conversation, not on the act of violence itself, but on the systemic issues it represented. "I am here not to cause disruption," she declared, her voice firm and resolute despite the lingering ache on her cheek. "I am here to demand respect and equality, values that should never be compromised, no matter the circumstances." Her words resonated through the cabin, stirring something deep within the hearts of those who had silently witnessed her struggle. It was at that moment that the flight attendants, previously complicit in a system of selective service, began to shift their demeanor. One of them, a younger attendant whose eyes betrayed both empathy and resolve, stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said softly, her voice tentative but sincere, "I'm terribly sorry for what you've just experienced." Her words, though few, were laden with the promise of solidarity, a small, yet potent, gesture that suggested change was possible, even in the confines of a rigid hierarchy. But the damage had been done. The once seamless operations of the flight had been irrevocably marred by an act of aggression that not only targeted Serena but also exposed the fractures within an institution that prided itself on efficiency and decorum. The captain's authority, once an unassailable bulwark, now wavered under the collective gaze of an audience that had begun to see her not as a symbol of order, but as an embodiment of systemic injustice. The flight's descent toward its destination was marked by a palpable tension, a suspended moment of reckoning that promised further repercussions. As the aircraft began to lower its altitude, Serena's thoughts were a turbulent mix of pain, defiance, and cautious hope. She knew that this incident, recorded from every angle by vigilant passengers, would soon reverberate far beyond the confines of the cabin. In a world increasingly defined by digital accountability, her experience was poised to become a catalyst for change, a beacon for others who had been silenced by discrimination and abuse of power. In that charged atmosphere, as the aircraft prepared for landing, the silence that had descended upon the cabin was punctuated by one final, resonant question, a question that challenged every passenger to reflect on the nature of authority and the price of unchallenged power. It was a moment that demanded introspection and action, a moment that would not soon be forgotten. How do you believe institutions should respond when their authority is misused in such a public and unjust manner? As the aircraft touched down on the runway, the echo of the confrontation still resonated in every corner of the cabin. The chaos that had unfolded in mid-flight, captured by countless smartphone cameras and shared in real time, had set in motion a chain of events that no one aboard could have foreseen. The final descent was marked not merely by the physical landing of the plane but by the impending landing of accountability, change, and transformation. Upon disembarking, Serena Carter was met by a flurry of activity that contrasted sharply with the earlier ordeals. Passengers, still abuzz with the shock of witnessing the captain's assault, clustered in small groups, whispering theories about what might come next. Some offered words of sympathy, while others quietly recorded further testimonies. The terminal itself became a stage for impromptu discussions about justice and the abuse of power, a raw, public acknowledgement of an injustice that had been, until that moment, hidden behind the polished veneer of airline professionalism. Within hours of landing, news of the in-flight incident spread like wildfire across social media and traditional news outlets. Headlines screamed of "Captain strikes passenger on board" and "In-flight assault exposes systemic racism in air travel." The viral footage left little room for ambiguity. A uniformed authority figure, once revered, had crossed an unthinkable boundary by striking Serena, a woman who had simply been asserting her right to be treated with dignity and respect. The response from the airline was swift and severe. Azure Skies Airways, once considered a pillar of luxury and exclusivity, scrambled to contain the fallout. An emergency press conference was convened within hours, and the airline's CEO, Richard Hamilton, appeared before a barrage of cameras. His expression was somber as he offered a public apology, stating, "The actions of Captain Victoria West and the subsequent failure of our crew to uphold our commitment to equality are utterly unacceptable. We are instituting immediate measures to ensure that such an incident never occurs again." However, even as his words attempted to smooth over the crisis, the public's demand for accountability grew louder. Within the next 90 minutes, airport security and local law enforcement arrived at the terminal. The very cameras that had recorded the event provided incontrovertible evidence that the captain had not only committed assault but had done so in a manner that revealed long-standing discriminatory practices. Under mounting pressure, Captain West was taken into custody. The arrest, executed with a formality that belied the gravity of the situation, symbolized a dramatic reversal of power, a moment when the authority that had once oppressed was held accountable by the same system it had sought to manipulate. In the days that followed, an intensive investigation was launched. Regulatory bodies, including the Federal Aviation Administration, intervened to review not only the actions of Captain West but the entire operational culture of Azure Skies Airways. Testimonies from passengers and crew members, many of whom had been unwilling or too frightened to speak up until now, painted a picture of a workplace rife with implicit biases and discriminatory practices. The investigation revealed that the captain's behavior was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of unchecked authority and systemic injustice, a pattern that had allowed a few individuals to thrive at the expense of countless others. Serena, having maintained her composure throughout the ordeal, found herself at the center of a public dialogue on discrimination and power. Her detailed, contemporaneous notes, taken during every humiliating moment of her journey, became critical evidence. They were presented in congressional hearings and served as a catalyst for policy changes across the aviation industry. No longer was the incident seen as an aberration, it was recognized as a symptom of a deeply ingrained problem that demanded radical reform. The ensuing legal proceedings brought about significant consequences for those responsible. Captain West, whose uniform had once symbolized unquestioned authority, was charged with assault and misconduct. Her trial, broadcast nationwide, became a defining moment in the fight against institutional discrimination. The courtroom was filled with palpable tension as witness after witness recounted their experiences of bias and mistreatment, not only on that fateful flight but in countless other instances across the airline's operations. When the verdict was delivered, a sentence that included probation, mandatory anti-bias training, community service, and a permanent ban from employment in the aviation sector, it sent a resounding message: no position of power is immune from the consequences of abusing it. For Azure Skies Airways, the scandal was a turning point. The airline's board initiated sweeping reforms aimed at dismantling the very systems that had allowed discrimination to flourish. Mandatory bias training was introduced for every employee, from baggage handlers to executive leadership. New protocols were implemented to ensure that all passengers, regardless of race or background, were treated with equal respect and efficiency. Advanced, technology-driven measures, such as blind boarding processes and automated service tracking, were adopted to minimize human discretion in routine procedures, effectively reducing opportunities for prejudice to influence decisions. Moreover, a dedicated office for diversity, equity, and inclusion was established, staffed by experts committed to monitoring and reporting any deviations from the new standards. Regular audits, transparent reporting mechanisms, and independent oversight by civil rights organizations became integral parts of the airline's operational framework. The once opaque practices that had shielded discriminatory behavior were replaced by a culture of openness and accountability, where every employee was empowered to speak out against injustice without fear of retribution. Serena Carter, now a symbol of resilience and righteous defiance, continued her career in public service with renewed determination. Her ordeal, though deeply painful, had become a source of inspiration for many. In the months following the incident, she traveled widely, speaking at conferences and community events about the importance of confronting bias head-on and advocating for systemic change. Her narrative, marked by quiet dignity and unyielding resolve, resonated with people from all walks of life. "I stand not only for myself," she would say, "but for every person who has ever been made to feel less than they are. Our dignity cannot be questioned, and our worth must never be diminished by prejudice." The public response to the incident had far-reaching implications. Social media campaigns under hashtags like #FlyingEqual and #StandWithSerena mobilized thousands of individuals who shared their own stories of discrimination, sparking a broader national conversation about equality and justice in everyday life. Policymakers took note, and legislative measures were introduced to strengthen anti-discrimination laws in public transportation and service industries. The ripple effects of one painful experience extended far beyond the confines of a single flight, transforming an entire sector and inspiring hope for a more just future. Inside the walls of Azure Sky's Airways headquarters, the board convened an emergency meeting to review their commitment to ethical practices. The discussion was candid, even raw, as executives acknowledged past failings and vowed to rebuild trust with the public. A comprehensive review of the company's culture, hiring practices, and customer service protocols was initiated, with the aim of creating an environment where diversity was not just tolerated, but celebrated. The transformation was daunting, but the leadership was resolute. The status quo was no longer acceptable in a world that demanded fairness and accountability. In the aftermath of the incident, as legal battles subsided and reforms took hold, a sense of cautious optimism began to permeate the industry. Passengers, once wary of enduring subtle slights and overt discrimination, found reassurance in the newfound transparency and commitment to justice. The long, painful road toward equality had gained a powerful ally in a woman who had refused to be silenced, a reminder that every act of resistance, however small, could spark the flames of change. Serena's journey, from a quiet, dignified passenger enduring endless indignities to a figure of transformative justice, was a testament to the enduring power of resilience and truth. Her experience was no longer just a personal battle, it had evolved into a collective call for accountability that reverberated across industries and communities. In the wake of systemic change, the voices of those who had long been marginalized found a platform, their stories no longer relegated to the margins but celebrated as the driving force behind a more equitable society. As the dust settled and new protocols began to take effect, the legacy of that turbulent day aboard Azure Sky's Airways continued to inspire change. It was a poignant reminder that while the structures of power may sometimes be impervious to criticism, they are not immune to the persistent, determined push for justice. The transformation was far from complete, but it had undeniably begun, with one brave woman's unwavering insistence on being seen, heard, and respected. What lasting changes do you believe are necessary to ensure that every individual is treated with dignity and fairness in our daily lives? In the wake of injustice, we find our strength not only in our righteous anger but in our capacity for love and compassion. This story is a powerful reminder that every act of discrimination diminishes us all, yet it also ignites the spark of transformation. Let it be a call for each of us to stand up, not with hatred, but with a profound love for our fellow human beings, a love that demands fairness, celebrates diversity, and nurtures the spirit of community. Together, we can build a future where every individual is cherished and respected. If you believe in a world filled with justice and love, subscribe to our channel and join the movement for real change.